All right, guys, we're ready to move ahead here. We have wrapped up our discussion for now with photography. We will see it return in the early 20th century with the art of Alfred Stieglitz, who takes the art form and kind of elevates it even higher as one that can challenge composition on equal footing with painting that's going on by the avant-garde. So we will come back to photography later and continue on into the 20th century with a discussion on abstraction. But to take a quick look at what's going on mid-century for painting, we have to look to the art of Gustave Courbet and the movement that he's going to be synonymous with realism. Keeping in mind where we've come from before, you guys realize we started off talking about the Baroque and Rococo after the break. And now we've moved on to the era of the Enlightenment, Neoclassicism, Romanticism, and now its equal and opposite reaction, realism. Realism is basically what is championed as painting of the modern life. And what you're going to find is that people are clamoring for an honest art that captures the world in a way that is true, that is not one that is embellished, one that is not fanciful and given over to the pursuits of the ancient regime and the powers that are still firmly holding on to European monarchies all over. Basically, what we're going to see here is an art that really tries to broach these issues in a way that is synonymous with the academic tradition, but done in a style that is almost anti-academic and poses a sincere challenge for the institution of the academy. So this is the work, The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet. Happens right at mid-century, so it's fairly easy to remember. And just prior to 1850, literally 1848, there had been one of a series of really violent uprisings that overthrew the monarch Louis Philippe. So that was not just an uprising in Paris. It was an uprising pretty much in every major industrial city that had come to the power during this time period, putting lots and lots and lots of workers in close quarters without really elevating their status along with those of the wealthy capitalists made the situation ripe for people to be, a little more class conscious than they had been in previous centuries. In this picture, I want you to make a note that while Gustave Courbet saw these two workers working in the field, he had them come to his studio and he staged this painting all in studio. So we are not quite to the point where painters are working their final compositions out in the field, what's known as en plein air. That will come next class, where we're basically talking about Monet and Impressionism. So this is still very carefully staged art. Now, what you're going to notice immediately about it is the color palette. The color palette is almost all browns, blacks, and grays. And it's painted in such a way that there's a very strong truthfulness to the way we see rocks and grass formations and hill formations. The stone breakers is one of the lowest jobs that you could have. This stone will go to Paris to pave the city streets. So it represents a very low station and one that you could consider hard labor. The symbolism of choosing a young laborer and an old laborer seems to suggest that this is a lifelong endeavor, one that you will not easily get out of, given the old shoes that the man is wearing that look more like clogs, and the ripped and tattered and torn shirts that both of the workers wear. Normally, this kind of depiction you would see romanticized in some form or fashion, with the workers taking up a small portion of the painting and the broad landscape taking the chief role. But here it seems to be just a little bit reversed. We've elevated the size and grandeur of the figures themselves to where landscape is almost secondary. The landscape that we have to look at is not much to look at and doesn't really give us a ray of hope. There's a whole lot of dark, gloomy, black background and only a little bitty sliver of blue sky to look at way up in the right corner. So, by all intents and purposes, it seems like our workers are trapped by their surroundings rather than liberated by working in the out of doors. So, it has a more oppressive feel for that reason there. The distance that's created by having both of the figures turn away from the viewer seems to kind of create an uncomfortable distance that is not one that allows us to identify in any form or fashion with the workers. They are a working unit that is removed from our world, and we can see them very much like Courbet did as passersby. The surroundings of the figures, the meager portions or rations that they'll have later, indicated by the crock pot that you see over there, the stock pot. The toughness of the terrain and the textures, all of this Courbet is trying to emphasize and make as honest as possible without any glorification whatsoever. So you should probably also make note this work was lost to us in World War II. There was a bombing in Dresden, and this work was on its way to be safely stored when the truck that was carrying it was hit by an Allied bomb. What we know of it, we know in color photographs. So we're kind of doing this in hindsight. I should probably make an emphasis, a pretty important note here that may not be pretty obvious to you. Courbet's emphasis on line is pretty heavy and strong, and it seems to kind of delineate our figures in a discernible way. They're not like being blended into the landscape in a way that you would see if you were looking at a Rococo painting or a Baroque masterpiece where you have movement and motion through time. This is almost a static, full stop, if you will, with the figures really kind of arresting and grabbing our attention and making us wonder about their plight or situation. If you were to compare this to similar work that was going on at the same exact time, you might consider that its rendering is a little less optimistic than this one. This is Francois Millet and the Gleaners that was referenced in your reading, and it seems to be a more poetic homage to the idea of work. The Gleaners are picking up grains of leftover wheat after the harvest has come and gone. The bread presumably is being sent to Paris to feed the people there, and these workers are gathering what's left over in the field. Now, their connection to the land is an humbling kind of connection. They bend over in a rhythm of workers that kind of creates a pyramid, and their close proximity is relieved by having that vast expanse of a landscape to look at behind them. So it has a very different feel than that of our workers here. The palette is also not nearly as somber. It has blues, it has pinks, it has grays, essentially a brighter and softer palette that's warmer and more endearing than what we have with Gustave Courbet and his work. So the effect on the viewer is completely opposite of that homage to work. Now, guys, considering what's going on in the politics of the day at the time, you have to realize that whenever you make the worker as large a part of the composition as this, you are trying to make something on the grand scale. You're trying to make something on the grand manner. That's typically reserved for history paintings and religious paintings, not for genre paintings of everyday laborers. So what might seem like an innocuous piece to us, just some people working at their job, was really kind of like a cannon fire shot, like a fire across the bow. Saying, workers, see yourselves, unite. This is unjust, and you should rise up and band together. And it was the beginning of a very important class consciousness or warlike mentality that would carry on all the way through the rest of the century. Celebrations of the worker, usually by capitalists, were synonymous with communism. And the fact that Marx and Engels had just written their book in 1848 kind of makes that clear. This seems to be a celebration of the worker and their contribution, not the industrialists or capitalists. So this would have been seen as something that was as threatening as something, say, like Lady Liberty leading the people. So it has all of those political connotations that your powers would not have wanted to see. Okay. In this large scale work, I just wanted to show you briefly. Courbet calls this his like life's passion and an allegory for everything that he's ever done. He uses this large scale canvas to kind of present what he's trying to tell people about where he thinks painting should go next, and kind of is divided into three parts. The center part of it here features the artist. And a landscape, nature as it is, right? Unadorned and undressed, with basically the natural landscape providing a model. He's teaching that process to a young boy here who also has his trusty companion. And the whole idea of the thing is truthfulness and fidelity. And that's why I think we have the female here, his muse, pausing mid dress. She's not going to pose herself. She's going to basically follow along and watch his indication of nature. So this is kind of where the action is. Over on his left side, we have the world of the old school. We see academic subjects like memento mori and music instruments and people in comic opera costumes. We see a nude male in a stage of undress, and we see Turkish characters who have been staged. These are all the basic topics of Romanticism and movements that had come even before Romanticism. They are the has-beens in the mind of Courbet, so they don't need to be featured in art anymore. Over on our right, right behind Courbet, we have the contemporary Parisians who are friends of the artist, who come to watch him work, to make notes as he works, and pay attention to what his message is. This guy right here is Charles Baudelaire, and you saw him in the photograph by Nadar. He's here reading the book in which he coined the phrase "heroism of the modern life." He really thinks that this kind of painting in somber colors, the contemporary world that we actually inhabit, is what art desperately needs. So he often shows up as a supporter of Courbet in the process of coming up with this new kind of art. These are large paintings, and you can see that he means to make an academic lesson out of what he's trying to say. And basically is successful in kind of turning the direction of art toward a more modern focus. In this work, this is kind of like his first piece that champions the ideals of realism. It's called Burial at Ornans. Ornans is the place that he was born in, and it's a provincial town in the north of France, well outside of Paris. And it was kind of appreciated for its the people who lived here had simple ways of life that were still followed. You can see that there is a tomb that has been built into the ground. There's a grave, right? And that inside that grave shortly will be placing a body. We have the church over here. We have townspeople in the middle, and we have the mourners, the females, on the right. These are the grave diggers here who pause for just a minute while a blessing is said, but you can see it's really not the focus of the painting. People are multifocal in their attention, and they deal with their grief in a variety of different ways. Now, with the body already in the grave, you can see what the burials are all about, right? The people who are left behind. And as a contemporary kind of comment, he has minimized the size of that crucifix. So putting church in its place along with the people that are left behind essentially is what he's known for. His most famous saying of all, one that you probably have to remember, is that he refused to paint angelic creatures because he had never seen them. He said, "Show me an angel and I'll paint one." And that was his emblematic salvo. So what you have here essentially is a crucifix on a standard as the staff is being carried by the people who have come from the church. They pause and take a moment for their grief, but it's not the only thing that's going on, right? You have a lot of people here. The dog is not even paying attention. I mean, there's no semblance of sympathy for the person who has died. And that runs in direct contrast with a burial that had been painted a couple of centuries before. This is the Burial at Ornans by El Greco. the burial at Ornans. This is the burial of Senor Orgaz. And I know that some of you have seen this in your Spanish literature classes. So I wanted to take up an opportunity to show you burials in the Catholic world look very, very different than they do at Ornans in the contemporary world. This man has died, and he's wearing Toledan armor and is being laid to rest by saints who have come from heaven for the event. Around them are all of the saints who add up to anything in the Christian teachings, as well as every wealthy man from Toledo. Above them, a vision of heaven opens up, and you see the soul of the deceased being carried up into heaven. In between the intercessors, Mary and St. John the Baptist, and Christ there sits in heaven, ready to judge whether or not the man is going to make it in. So it's a much more dramatic affair, this thing, death and burial. And here it seems like we have contemporary issues that are taking our focuses elsewhere. So it's quite an interesting piece. But as far as portraiture goes with Courbet, guys, he preferred to do the unposed portrait. As you can see, his best friend writer Proudhon here is featured as a man in nature with his daughters, who do a variety of different things and do anything but sit still as if they're being staged. Here we have Courbet's version of the source. The start of a river had often been the topic of academic painters and their focus on classical paradigms. And what you get from Courbet is something that's not the polished veneer of a classicism that is not, contemporary. You get the female figure of a contemporary female posing at the head of a river. Here, the spinner has fallen asleep at the wheel, and that would have been a commentary on labor and its working standards for the poor, who must work often from the moment they wake up to the moment they pass out from exhaustion. So he did and visited this topic in more ways than one, and I hope that you'll see this as a standout piece in the image set.